In the early British colonies, one of the most devastating pandemics was the smallpox outbreak, which swept through colonial America multiple times, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. Smallpox, a highly contagious and deadly virus, decimated populations, especially Native American communities who had no immunity to the disease. Colonial towns and cities experienced high mortality rates, overwhelming their limited medical knowledge and resources. Vaccination efforts eventually began in the late 1700s, but the early pandemics left a lasting impact on both the colonial economy and society, shaping public health responses for years to come. The perks of colonial life, plus a few plagues. Life in the colonies had its ups and downs. On the plus side, you didn't have to worry too much about your neighbor's cough turning into a cholera outbreak unless you lived in the cities. Quarantines were a thing back then too, but if you were out in the countryside, you could go months without seeing your neighbors anyway. No one's passing you typhoid from 6 miles away, right? Now, if you were living in the southern colonies, you did have to deal with the occasional bouts of malaria or yellow fever. Those southern bugs weren't messing around, but thankfully up in the northern colonies, those illnesses were like tourists. They only showed up when it got really hot, so yes, disease was an issue, but compared to tropical regions or even Europe at the time, it wasn't that bad. Speaking of not that bad, let's talk about tea. It wasn't just the fashionable drink of the day. This British imported beverage had a hidden superpower. Since the colonists had to boil water to make their tea, they unknowingly killed off all sorts of bacteria in the process. And let's not forget alcohol, the other beloved drink of the era. It's not exactly your go-to for a health boost, but hey, it killed bacteria too. If you think about it, between tea and alcohol, the colonists were surviving partly thanks to their beverage choices. Cheers to that. Diet, more calories, less worry. Another secret to colonial longevity, a pretty decent diet, all things considered. Thanks to all that open land, there was plenty of room for crops. Colonists were growing wheat, apples, and other staples, plus being near the coast meant they had access to all the fish they could eat. Now don't get too excited. They weren't dining on gourmet meals, but compared to the average 18th century diet in Europe, the colonists were living large. More land also meant more economic opportunities. It wasn't all about farming either. There was trade, local manufacturing, and other avenues for wealth. As a result, people had more food on the table and, in general, were better off than many of their European counterparts. Plus, literacy rates were higher, so even if you weren't loaded with cash, you had a decent chance of getting an education. Don't bother me, Britain. The real cherry on top? By 1763, Britain mostly left the colonies alone. The British government was pretty hands-off, letting the colonies manage their own affairs. The king may have had his eye on the colonies, but he wasn't micromanaging them. The Virginia Company, for example, handled the day-to-day decisions, set up a judicial system, and even created the House of Burgesses, a representative body that made local laws. It was a system that worked well for most colonists. They could live their lives with minimal interference from across the pond. In fact, this level of independence felt pretty good, so good that, after the 7 Years' War, the colonists were quite content. Sure, they still appreciated their ties to Britain, but they also recognized that their setup was better than what most people had elsewhere. Colonial governments, local, loose, and pretty, chill in Massachusetts and really across all 13 colonies, the king granted each colony a charter that allowed them to set up their own local governments. These governments weren't distant or out of reach. They were local, meaning the people running the show were often just down the road. Towns set up their own courts to handle everything from property disputes to minor legal matters. So, if you had an argument with your neighbor about whose cow wandered onto whose land, you didn't have to wait for some royal decree from Britain. Local judges or officials handled it right there, which is nice. This system of local governance meant that the British government had little day-to-day interference in the lives of most colonists. Decisions about how to run the town, how to resolve disputes, or even how to defend against threats were largely handled by people you knew. This local control created a sense of independence and self-reliance that would later fuel revolutionary sentiments. The pandemics in the British colonies, like smallpox, taught the importance of natural holistic approaches to health and prevention. Colonists relied on traditional remedies, herbal medicines, and community care to manage disease outbreaks. Isolation, fresh air, proper nutrition, and natural treatments were seen as essential to healing and maintaining wellness. While limited medical knowledge sometimes hindered effective responses, these holistic methods highlighted the value of nature-based health practices and community cooperation in overcoming widespread illness. This approach laid the foundation for a balance between natural healing and more scientific methods in managing future health crises.
In the dawn's early light, our flags were sown with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the drum beats in our hearts, we chased away the dark. Men of